I'm showing up in this space is I want to make sure that I'm helping folks level up themselves, their skills, or even the way that they think about developer relations. And so, in this regard, I want y'all to like interrupt me and ask questions. To date, the way that we've been having these have been very conversational, and I want to keep that same vibe. If there's something that I think is covered in a slide later on, I'll sort of bring it up then. But if not, I'll answer it directly on the spot if that's cool with y'all. Which is why, Rizal, we love the baby in the background because it makes it real. I said before I support all things at Off Zero, but then I realized a lot of folks don't actually know a good bit about me. So let me just share some background on me. In the top sort of left side, in the work that we do for Off Zero, a big part of what DevRel is trying to do is continue to maintain that developer love and continue to grow that developer affinity, especially in the world of identity, where there's a lot of like mom and pop companies sort of popping up every single day who are legitimately trying to come for Off Zero's food. I promise you the biggest threat we keep thinking about is not so much the mom and pops, but more the developers who say the experience that those mom and pop companies give is one that we need to be keeping an eye on and continuing to ask ourselves, how do we level up our game? And so I used to co-lead DevRel with my peer there, Anna. Today, we still are one of the two managers of DevRel. There are two other folks within our leadership team. And I think many folks don't realize that Off Zero is owned by Okta. So technically I work for Okta, even though I always talk about Off Zero. If you go just to the right of that picture, you'll see my two kids. Everything I do is for my kids. You will hear me say this because it's important. That is Rita's Water ICC because we live just outside of the Philadelphia area. It is the only reason why I live outside of this area is because their mom has employment here. But I take this work very seriously because I care about the developers I serve. Doing so allows me to be able to afford a quality of life that enables them to have the ability to do exactly this. Hang out on a Friday afternoon in the back of the car and eat some water ice. So they always make an appearance in every single one of my presentations, and they always will in some way, shape, or form. And then if you come down, you'll see I live stream and I still live stream. There are folks who've caught my live streams. And the reason why I live stream is because I fundamentally believe that the best developer advocates are developers first and advocates second. And so if I'm not keeping my dev skills sharp, I'm no good to any developer because then the developer can't trust me. That authenticity has to be there. And if it's not, then I would absolutely challenge whether or not I could be as effective in DevRel as someone who is actually writing code. So for those, some folks here have heard me say this, I don't get to go to events as much because I have the two kids. So I do still use live streams, meetups, virtual meetups, and other ways to stay connected to the developer community. And these are themes that you'll hear me talk about a good bit more throughout the deck. But let me now challenge y'all real quick and just ask a question. My next slide is a fun one. You see I have a list of ingredients on the left side. Why do you think I've included this in the deck? I'm super curious to hear what y'all think.
You about to cook us up something?
Wouldn't you think so?
No, you're vindictive. You just want to make us hungry. That's what you do.
Nah, but you know what's real though? I'm actually very hungry and I didn't get to eat lunch today. So that's actually a fair shout. But no, that's not it. I'll take one more guess.
My guess was that it's about ingredients and like these are some of the pieces that get to those pictures later, and so it's sort of the beginning of the storytelling of how we get to the finished DevRel strategy. That's my guess.
That is exactly right. That is spot on. I'll share this the same way I've said this a couple other times. One of the things that I love about developer relations and that makes developer relations incredibly hard is I can give three people the same list of ingredients and get three completely different things out of them. In this case, you take this list of ingredients and they mostly contribute to the 3 different dishes that you see on the right. All of them equally delicious, all of them equally solving a problem, and yet still 3 very different things. DevRel is set up to do that by design. I'm going to keep saying that because part of what y'all are hearing me say at the start of this is what my personal take is on DevRel. It doesn't mean I have the answer for how you should do DevRel. It means I have some ideas and I have a little bit of a framework, but I could totally give you this framework. You take it and come up with something completely different. And that is okay. So long as you measure it and it proves itself to be okay. Meaning, if we took that chicken parm up top and it was not salted and someone tasted it and was like, but you gave me the list. Well, hold on. Your job was to put salt into it, if that makes sense. And so in this regard, I always talk about how food is the closest thing to DevRel to me because I am someone who does really well in public spaces, even though I don't get to do it as much. That's why you see that picture of me on the left. I love it. I light up. You can literally see it in the picture. I am not someone who does well writing blogs, which is crazy because I run a developer content team. So why do I run a developer content team? Because content is more than blogs, right? But I still will write blogs whenever I can, right? And I know that about myself. But in this regard, y'all heard me talk about doing live streams earlier. On the right side, you see I'm legitimately doing an interview with some folks over at, this was Microsoft. This is an old interview. But I say that to say, I make DevRel work for me so that I can then achieve the goals that I need to achieve. Does that make sense? Hopefully like that resonates with some of the stuff we've been talking about.
I have a quick question.
What's up?
So, like, your strategy kind of moving forward is also kind of fueled by your own kind of personal goals, or is it more like a matter of, how do I put this? Is it more a matter of your personal experiences is like how you drive kind of moving? It's hard to describe, but is it like your own experience driving how you think about DevRel strategy in general? I guess that's
part,
the
yes.
more succinct way of.
No, in part, that's it. It's about me tapping into my strengths as an individual first, the things that I'm interested in. And if you do the things you're interested in, you're more inclined to do more of that, if that makes sense. That doesn't mean you should stay there. Let me be really clear about that. But it does mean you should start there. And the reason why is because if you start there, you can easily build a body of experience, content, expertise, relationships, and all the things. So I'm very much on this notion of start with what you know and what you like and use that to be your entry point to then expand into all the other things, if that makes sense. Does that help, Chad?
Yeah, it does. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Okay. Let me throw one more thing now for y'all to think about, which is a different model. Because I'm talking a lot about me. And you'll hear me say this a lot, which is there is a thing that is very much about authenticity in DevRel. If you are not authentic, like if you're not your authentic self, developers can smell that and they will legitimately not trust you. And so when I think of DevRel, I think you have to be at the heart of it. Like literally you, the things you're interested in, the technologies you play with, the pet projects you want to build, that has to be at the heart of it, which is why you see me put this big U in the middle here. But then you need to scale. The point of developer relations is not for you to just go do a bunch of what I call shaking hands and kissing babies, which is why I always say, like, if you're only doing events, you're not doing part of the job. I fundamentally believe that DevRel has to have all 4 of these components. It starts with you. It continues with the one-to-one relationships that you curate, find, build. It then scales to what I call the one-to-some. This is a one-to-some where we have a small community of folks who we gather with, do developer relations types things or developer things, and then legitimately folks get value out of it. And then there's the one-to-many. And one-to-many is I'm broadcasting in a conference-like setting where I'm probably standing on a stage, can't get as much direct feedback, but can probably influence a lot of what you think. I think you have to be doing activities at these different levels. How many and how much you should invest in will depend upon what your company wants out of you. And I can't stress that enough. You shouldn't be saying for every DevRel thing, oh, I'm going to go do all these one-to-many if the company doesn't want that. So keep that in mind. Hopefully that makes sense. Because there's another sort of gear wheel I'm going to now sort of use to break the logic, which is I talked about this idea of you being at the heart of developer relations. And then I talked about this notion of continuing to be a developer while being in developer relations. There is this notion of you being a developer, and then there's this notion of you being a developer advocate or you being a developer evangelist, if that makes sense. And so I think the two have to work together. There are advocacy roles that have absolutely nothing to do with being a developer, which is why you see it sort of at the top there where it says, who are you as an advocate? Because being an advocate doesn't require you to be a developer. And being a developer, obviously you can do that and never be an advocate. But the challenge there is if you're gonna work in DevRel, you have to do that was supposed to say, how do you do developer advocacy? You have to do the developer advocacy part, which means you have to do both. You can't only do one and then forget about the other. You can spend time in more of one, which is why I have the developer one actually bigger than the other ones, but you can't forget about the others. And so this is where I think there's sort of three things that always guide me. I don't care about I'm not talking about company metrics. I'm not talking about revenue targets. I'm not talking about any of that. If I think about just me as a developer relations professional, there's three things that always guide me. One, what am I learning? If I'm not learning, then I'm doing something wrong. Because as a developer, we're always learning. Things break all the time and you have to go fix something. You're always learning. Two, what am I building? I have to be building, even if, and I'm gonna use this example, even if I'm building something that's what seems to be the simplest automation, I've got to be building. I've got to be keeping my hands deep in technology, deep in product, deep in something that enables me to say, oh, I have firsthand experience with this. And the reason why is because of sympathy and empathy. We'll come back to that. Three, what am I sharing? I don't do as much, you will probably not see me on as many conference stages as an example, but you will absolutely see me here, right? Where I'm okay, let me give some perspective. Let me give a scaled perspective, or alternatively, let me give you some ideas for ways to think about content, or alternatively, let me give you some ideas for projects you can go build, right? You have to be doing the three things. Because if you're not doing any of those, just as literally as a developer relations professional, I promise you're going to miss the mark and your value is going to get lower over time. Let me stop and see how that lands on y'all. Does that make sense?
I have a quick question in terms of the sharing, and I guess I'm trying to formulate it properly in my head. The share, because I'm imagining sharing as this, because I'm imagining, you're at work and you're talking about sometimes you're talking about, well, not sometimes, most of the times you're talking about what work wants you to talk about because of, you were saying, the metrics that the work cares about. But you say, you're very specific about sharing. And I was just kind of is it that you're specifically to kind of keep with the authenticity? Are you specifically sharing the things that you personally have learned and interact with? Or I guess, yeah, I'll stop. I'll stick to that.
Yes and yes. It is, so the sympathy and empathy piece is what's key here. One is you should always be sharing your experience. Why is because other people are probably experiencing the same thing you are and they want to find that sense of camaraderie. It's a social thing, and that social thing is very human. It's not, that sort of surpasses what job title you have, right? But then there is this empathy piece, which is someone may experience something that that is closely related to what you're experiencing, or few and far in between. And they'll see you write on a topic, they'll see you speak on a topic and say, oh, you may be an expert on something. Let me bring you my question, with the hope that you can possibly help them along their journey. There is this thing that comes from that enables you to then become a trusted expert, a trusted advisor. And that is just like sympathy and empathy is required to be in DevRel. That's one of my hot takes. Becoming a trusted influencer is a thing that I think you need to be aiming for in DevRel. Now, the reason why I didn't put that in my deck is because people hear the word influencer and they think Instagram. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about when you write a piece of something, or you create a video, or you get up on a stage and you speak, people listen. And when they listen, they refer back to you. And when they refer back to you, now you become the person that folks are like, oh, I want to hear more from them. That's a part of why you have to share. If you don't share, then people are going to be like, why the hell should I listen to you? Does that kind of answer your question?
No, it does. Thanks. Thanks so much.
Okay. And Jay, yeah, I may not get to your question now. I think I'm going to do it at the end of the deck, because that one's more of from a leadership perspective, how do you allocate resources, which is a very different kind of question.
Okay. I'll save all my leadership allocation of resources questions in, because I had one based on something you said. Because I'm being asked to allocate resources into communities that I'm just not a part of. And it's not that like I don't want to be a part of them. It's just that my entire career I was in this area, and now you're like, oh, hey, how many tens of thousands of dollars should we invest in this other area that I'm just like, I don't know how receptive they're going to be. I've never been to that conference. I've never been to that event. And the person that I replaced, it wasn't like, here are my notes. It was, oh, that person got laid off, so now that person doesn't want to do anything to help this company. So
yeah, it's a hard one when you have to think about how to tap into a new community. And this is one, let me switch slides real quick, because I may find a way to answer this. Because you have two sides to this. There's one side to this, which is very, as a developer relations or as a developer advocate, how do I tap into the community and figure out how that community gathers, what the pulse is in that community, and how to move things forward. Then there's a leadership aspect to this, which is, and how do I scale that? And where do I spend money to do that scale versus where do I invest in my individual contributor? That's why this is a difficult question. I'll come back to it. I'm going to talk about it a little bit, but I'll come back to it at the end, if that's okay with you.
okay.
Okay, let me tap into this real quick. I talked about this being like you, the developer, being at the heart of this, and you using that developer authenticity to then sort of become your scale factor, your unique scale factor. As you start to scale that out, one of the things that often comes up is folks are like, look, I just don't know how to define success. Like, what does it mean for me to define success at each of these levels? You know, sort of the one-to-one, one-to-some, one-to-many. What I think about is, and this kind of applies to some of Jay's situation there. If you literally start at the one-to-one, because I think you always have to start there, who are you talking to? What are you learning from these conversations? Time is the most valuable, precious you have, the most valuable, precious resource you have. And so in this regard, I'm often asking the questions when folks are getting into new communities. What are you learning? How does that community gather? How are you finding the conversations? Legitimately, it's one of those things where you have to start from there before you do anything else. Sure, you can be interested in the technology, but this side of it is more around, and how are you building relationships? So if you're building something, are you taking that with you into those conversations? I say that to say, I would not take something like this and be like, I talked to 40 new people this week, and look, this is what we got out of it. Be careful. Success here is more qualitative than quantitative. Yes, you can take into account the 40, but the next question the manager is going to ask you is, and what did you get from those conversations? What did you learn from those conversations? What are you going to apply from those conversations? And so I say that to say, think of this very much as you're just a developer trying to build relationships. That's all that is. That's all that is. If that, like, I'm almost oversimplifying because people have made this way too complicated, and it really doesn't need to be. It could truly be you're doing this on Twitter, you're doing this on Reddit, you're doing this on LinkedIn, you're doing this in person, at meetups, whatever. Just building relationships, right? Then there's, okay, how do I take those one-to-one relationships and start going into some bigger places? And what I mean when I say bigger places is there are scenarios where I've been paying a lot of attention to OpenAI. OpenAI has been doing these hackathon events where legitimately they're just called hack nights. They partner with another company. They gather in a space that is just big enough to host, I'm going to call it like 20 to 30 people. And in so doing, they get people to show up and just build with their platform. It's a community that's all of a sudden just thriving in local markets. It reminds me of a comment that I would often make, which is developers are still gathering post-pandemic or post-COVID, I should say, but they're gathering in different ways. How are you finding those communities? What are you doing to try to actively participate and engage there? How are you learning what folks are paying attention to, what folks are doing in those communities, what topics are resonating? Those are the types of details that you should be using to then inform how you should show up in that space. Sure, you're interested in a particular project. I love Rozelle's example of Goose, which is she's like, what if we could just do a Goose meetup that also helps to tell some of this AI story for how developers can increase and impact their or improve their productivity? Fantastic. I'd say, hey, maybe we do join like a local AI night, right? We throw a local AI night in a local market. We do it with a company that has a little bit of a reputation, positive reputation with developers. If other AI companies want to be a part of the journey, by all means, we'll take it because it makes sense for them to be there. You put a prompt out at the beginning of this night that says, hey, we have all these things for you to participate in. And then you allow folks to participate with the technologies, the products, but to go build what they want. And then as an advocate, at the end of the night, you say, here's all the projects that got built. Look, these are some of the different ideas. Here's some of the feedback that folks gave us about their experience with Goose. We should probably do something with this. And that's a way you can think about success. This is me taking a live example without having all of the constraints that Rozelle may have for how she thinks about her role. Rozelle, did I get this wrong? Yep, sounds right to Rozelle. Hopefully, again, it starts to get you to think about a way to show up that meets developers where they are now. And I'm really big on that because one of the big things I'm actually struggling with this right now is thinking through when do we try to get developers to come to us versus when do we go to developers? There is a time whereby you sort of have to do a little bit of both. And when you're a new product, you more are doing, hey, let me go out to you instead of get you to come to us. When you're an established product, it's probably easier to be like, oh, we're throwing this event, Mr. Big Company, whatever you are. And developers, if they like you or if they use you or if they've paid you, will show up. There's a balance there, but you got to just pay attention to where the developer community is. So hopefully that makes sense. And you'll see on my third bullet, it says you can measure both quantitatively and qualitatively. You should always think about both, right? Like, sure, you can capture easy to measure things like how many people showed up, how many people started doing things, building projects, how many people finished building projects, how long did it take people, right? Like, you can capture all of that. It's great feedback. Just go talk to people. The anecdotes are probably way more valuable than all of the 15 levels of numbers you can go. And the reason why is because when you share a physical space with someone, or if you share a time-bound space with someone in a virtual setting, them sharing their experience is probably the best thing you can get from that, if that makes sense. I want to hit Jay's comment because Jay said they worked at two places where they got them started up with meetups in the area and then decided to shut it down. And this is one of those things where I think about where and how community gathers. There's a time where I said this earlier, people gather because we're human. We're sociologically wired to want to be around like-minded people. There are many different data points. This is not an opinion, this is a fact. There are many different data points that prove this. And so in this regard, there will be a time where you'll see communities come together, developer communities come together, and they will start to transcend the original purpose for why they came together. It could be that a company started it and then all of a sudden they had to give it to the community because the community was just so active and so passionate about keeping it going, but it was going in a different direction than the company needed it to, or the company lost budget and couldn't support it. That's a healthy signal, I promise you. I had this conversation with someone else who legitimately was like, hey, we have an open source website and we use it within the company for developer marketing. It helps to drive some of our sign up. They'd like to close source the website. But then when we go look at the GitHub data tells us, no, people are actually downloading and playing with the code. Don't touch it. Leave it alone. That's a good problem to have, right? But these are some of the things that you have to balance when you are doing some things DevRel, if that makes sense. Okay, I did one to one, I did one to some. Let me do one to many. One to many. Okay, so if one-to-one is deep relationships, right? And you can get a lot of really rich feedback. One to some is not as deep, but closer than one to many, right? Where you can start to do some scale factors and experiment and see if they work. One to many is very much I am listening and learning from you. You're gonna tell me whether I'm actively hitting the mark. And that probably sounds weird, as like the example that I gave for one to many was if you're probably on a conference stage. So let me give you an example of why I say it this way. I love going to events where rooms are empty because that tells me we've missed the mark some way, somehow. Now, that doesn't mean that we should be at events where rooms are empty. Like, that's a terrible idea. That means someone actually did miss the mark. But it does tell me there's a need to pivot somewhere in how we're landing our messaging. There's a need to pivot somewhere in how we're landing a developer experience. There's a need to pivot maybe in the topic, right? The topic, content, promotion. There's a need to change. That's really rich feedback. Another way to think about this is if you go and do a talk and, you're starting to give your talk and you find your groove and all of a sudden you look up and you see people just like, They're like, nope, that's not it. Easy way for you to be like, okay, wait, I'm losing folks. Where did I lose them? Why did I lose them? How do I adjust course? Like, these are the types of things that I think of as spaces for you to capture some of that feedback where folks are talking to you. And I often think that in those spaces, your job is to sit back and just say, thank you for the feedback. That's it. Dig a little deeper, right? You could get a little defensive, but be very careful. Your job is truly just to be there to say, hey, thank you for the feedback. Because it would then help you recognize how you are being received in those developer communities. That's why I put that first bullet there, right? Which is you really do want folks to give you the most honest impression of what they think about you. And this is because part of advocacy is about being influential. And so in this regard, if you went up to someone and you say, hey, do you like me? They're gonna lie, right? Like, they're just gonna sit there and just be like, of course I like you. Or they're just gonna be really rude and be like, absolutely not. You are the worst person I've ever met, right? But in reality, that's not what you're wanting to know. What you really want to know is, do you trust me for my technical expertise? And do you think that based on my expertise, you'll follow some of the things that I'll say, do, make available for you to consume? And so this is where I think about this notion of how do you know if your message is landing? That's where those two questions come from. What are people saying about you? What are people saying about you in your content? How are you making it easy for folks to find you or your content? That's the one to many, right? What's your reputation? And it has absolutely happened to me. I promise you, I will never forget it. I think I shared this story with y'all where I went to London. I get to say I'm an international speaker, though not as much as many other people. I went to London and got on stage at a conference called ProgNet. And I gave a talk about what was at that time a new technology called Blazor, right? It was very new. And the premise and the value prop of Blazor is that you can build a web application with C#. You can stay away from JavaScript for most of it. And that value prop still holds true today. Shout out to us .NET developers. And a guy got up, he told me, because I talked to a full house. It was a full room. I was like, yes, I'm nailing this. He comes up to me after the talk. He goes, hey, listen, I just got to tell you, great talk. I just disagree with like 80% of everything you said. It was either 80 or 90%. And I was like, dang, that's harsh. Like, tell me how you really feel. Okay. And so in that same vein, I was like, all right, let me understand. Like, tell me more. Tell me why. Because what I learned from that is he said, look, when I think about software development and I think about separation of concerns, I would never want to build software in a way that allows me to do what Blazor is allowing people to do. Got it. His contention wasn't with me. His contention was with Microsoft and the fact that they had built the technology to be able to do that. And so in this regard, good feedback, great feedback for me to absorb and figure out what I could change. And I did change my talk because I did add a point in there to say, look, this approach to building software may not be your jam, but it is for this number of developers because they used to have a data point that I could use. And so this is that sort of stuff where I like what you're talking through, Jacob, there, where you're like, look, it's exactly right. We get to have the buy-in conversation. You may not have been convinced when I was on the stage, but you would be convinced when we have the one-to-one conversation, right? And so this is a part of why you do need some of those experiences to help influence how you're building what you're doing, whether it's the content you're doing, the projects you're doing, the talks you're giving, the way in which you're thinking about technology. You do need that feedback because this is the advocacy portion of it. So I did a lot of talking right now, very much about like you as an individual contributor. I didn't talk a lot about companies. Let me just stop and see if there's questions I can answer before I hit the company aspect, because now we hit the dark side. Is there any questions I can answer for y'all? Yeah, Jay's just having fun in the comments. All right. Rizal says super clear. All right, cool. So now let me bring in the company side to this. Because a lot of what you've heard me talk about is about you being at the heart of DevRel. That authenticity has to be there. If you don't feel or have that authenticity, I would tell you question. And I'm saying this as someone who's been in DevRel now for, let me do the math, 2025, for 8-9 years of my career. I legitimately believe you should question that, right? And just make sure that it's the right fit for you. That being said, I talked about this a few weeks ago within the group where I talked about this idea of what it means to do developer relations separate from a company and what it means to do it with a company. And doing it with or for a company requires you to take that company's perspective into account. So one of the things that I often say is there are some very specific questions you need to make sure you get answers to. The first one being just what is the company's goal? Like at the end of the day, companies exist to make money. I'm not saying that's the goal. What is their true North Star? When I think about Auth0, it is very explicitly, they want to make identity their problem so that other developers and companies do not have to do it on their own. Because when those companies do, it costs them more money, more time, and more customers to be able to achieve the mission. So when I think about my company, that's how I think about it. Y'all should be able to answer that same question for yourselves. What is your company's goal? And then the addendum to that is, and where do developers fit in that picture? And from an Auth0 perspective, it is very clearly, you make identity our problem by letting the developers truly build an integration with us so you can offboard that to us, and we will protect you. We will protect your identities. We will secure those identities with the latest and greatest standards so that you never have to think about it, all by empowering your developers. You gotta have an easy answer to that. If you don't have an easy answer to that, if you don't have an easy answer to like this part, I'm gonna tell you go get the answer to this immediately, right? Because then there's the other side to this is if you know where developers fit, then you can get a clear sense of what does the company want out of developers that they can say was success. For Auth0, it's very clearly they want monthly active users. This is the number we report on when we report on our public earnings, right? The more monthly active users we have, the more it means developers or companies are onboarding to our product. The more that's happening, the more we know we're hitting the mark, right? Because our product is built for developers. But you see, I put this thing in here in parentheses that says, I put understand how your company measures success with developers, parentheses, and where you can influence it. Part of our job as advocates is to always represent the external developer from inside the company. And so part of that requires us to figure out very explicitly what are opportunities for us to actually move the needle to make this the best experience for developers. And so this is where I talk about the company's developer journey. Every company has a different developer journey map. If you've never heard of a journey map, it is legitimately the way in which someone experiences your product. They exist, it's a marketing thing. They exist for every persona that a company will sell money to. And when I say they exist for every persona, every company has one. Even if they don't have it written down, every single company has one. The way that I tend to think about it, there's about 4 to 5 phases to this. There's product awareness, right? Do you know about me? Product onboarding. Okay, can you start using me? Product activation. Did you start using me? Product retention. Will you keep using me? And then product engagement. And how do I stay connected to get more reasons to keep using the product? Does that kind of make sense? Right? It's a very clear journey. And you jump sort of back and forth, right? Where sometimes you do the first part and then you jump to the fourth part. It just depends on what stage you're at. But there's always a developer journey. To me, it's just those 4 things. I've seen the one that, I forget what they all stand for, AAA, triple RP. I forget what they all stand for, but I've seen that exact model. It's the exact same thing. Literally the exact same thing. There's that side of it, right? Which is like sort of the developer journey. And then or just like the company product journey. But then for developers, there's the 3 other things that I think are really important. One is community. And the reason why is because as humans, we like to gather, as developers even more, because we're highly opinionated. And so just like people call Reddit, one of the worst parts of the internet, when people have strong opinions and they find other people who have strong opinions, they will gather together to try to amplify their strong opinions. The same happens on X every single day. Community is a really important thing and has to fit somewhere in that journey. Content. Content. Developers and content. So we all sort of believe that developers don't like being marketed to. And I always say that's not it. It's that developers don't like bad marketing. If you tell me, oh, this product's going to be great, that doesn't help me as a developer. But if you tell me, oh, this product can help you do this, and to get started, follow these 3 steps very clearly, bam, magic, money. So I always say, anytime I hear the phrase developers don't like being marketed to, that's not it. It's that developers don't like bad marketing. And guess what? No one likes bad marketing. If you go to a church and you went into that church with a Playboy ad, someone would say, yo, you in the wrong spot, homeboy. You got to figure it out. Again, no one likes bad marketing. Got to know your audience. You got to know what you're trying to get out of them. You got to position it in a way that makes sense for them. Hopefully that makes sense, but it has to be a part of the developer journey. And I'm saying this like it has to be in all phases of that journey. And then there's feedback. Developers are highly, highly, highly opinionated. And while some will more loudly share their opinions, others will hold their opinions, but will use those opinions to influence things like business outcomes. And so one of the things that I often remind folks is the developer community is larger than social media will let you believe. If we keep sort of thinking that developers are only the developers we find on social media, we'll miss the mark, because there are thousands, if not millions of developers who never touch social media every single day. So how do you give them the chance to give you feedback? These are the things that are really, really, really important, right? Now, I put this table in here just for the purposes of the deck, because I think the deck needs to be a little bit of a living document. Disregard this table, right, for the purpose of this conversation, but it hopefully sort of brings a little bit of life to the things that I've been talking through. Because the next side to this is, how do you put all of this together and formulate a strategy? And so my take on this is two things. One is, start with defining clear objectives. And those objectives have to align across the journey. You start with, and I put a sample, right? Just an example. Hey, I want to start by spending the next 3 months learning on this particular technology. And I think because I'm a manager, I think in halves and quarters, not really months. So sorry, I'll have to do a little bit of translation. But it is very much this idea of, like, I'm going to take the next couple months. If the company says this particular product release is really important, I'm going to take this next couple of months and dive deep into this particular product area. What are the pain points? What's the problem we're trying to solve? How are we trying to solve that? What's the developer experience around it? What are the things we're trying to do, right? I want to find and help a community, build a community around this particular pain point, this particular problem we're trying to solve. And then I'm going to go influence this based upon the feedback that I get, right? Clear objectives. Whatever you do, make it measurable. Whatever you do, make it measurable. And whatever you measure, make sure you tell people about it. One of the biggest problems I have with someone on my team right now, they do the best work. They do not talk about it. The only time people find out about it is because someone happened to have spotted it somewhere out in the wild. And so legitimately, it is very much, make sure you have clear objectives, make sure you measure the things, and go talk about the things. Does that make sense? Let me stop there. Let me just stop there before I legitimately lose people, because I want to make sure this makes sense. And it's not that much more complicated. It really isn't. Be specific about the phases of the journey that you're trying to hit and how you're trying to hit it. What tactics you're using that are trying to hit that. So that way you're not measuring stuff that has nothing to do with what the company cares about. That's the other thing I would add here. I didn't put it on the slide. So yeah. And yes, this is one of those many questions I'm always asking as well. Like, as a person who manages a content team, there are 3 questions I'm always asking. One is, how many pieces of content am I going to get from this idea? Who's going to do the work to tell me if it worked or not? Because I'm not going to do it. Because if I do it, then that's a waste of my time, right? Like, I want people to feel a sense of ownership over the content they create. And then the third bit that I'm thinking about is, how are you positioning this with the community? I don't care about, like, my team will often say, hey, I want to get the Auth0 team, the Auth0 handle will often share more of my content. I don't care about that. I really don't, because that's one way to share. You could also go put it in LinkedIn. You could go put it on Reddit. You could go do a video and create a video and drop that on TikTok and Instagram. Just how are you getting it in front of the community? I want you to have an answer to that. Otherwise, the content's not valuable to me. Rizal, I see your question there. It says, any tips for encouraging teammates to share their work more often? What strategies work for people who feel uncomfortable? You got to figure out what they value or figure out what the company values. If the company values getting more views and you can demonstrate that by sharing that work, they got more views, ta-da. It's really that simple. And that's from a company perspective. If they value being like respected as a thought leader, go get the number of times that piece of content was shared when shared in like either internal channels or external channels, and say, look, your content's being referenced. You are becoming more influential. Ta-da. That's why I say just start from one of those 2 places. Okay.
I have a quick question. Oh, sorry. I might have interrupted somebody else, did I?
No, you're good.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I have a quick question. Can you, so you talked about like the developer journey and the specific phases of another model for the developer journey that was in the chat, which I'm not going to say because it's a very, 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 very long acronym. The question that I have is, do you find that there are people who either become naturally experts at, influencing a particular part of the journey? Or is it just that you just generally, you you just kind of float around the entire journey as you're needed?
Dude, that's a tricky one. There's a couple ways to answer that. So let me think about this. How I would say that is yes and yes. There are some folks who do let me actually go back a couple slides. There are some folks who do a really good job in specific phases of the journey. I tend to say like developer marketers are really good at certain phases of this. And there's a difference between developer advocacy and developer marketing. I will probably shout that from the rooftops. Developer marketing absolutely cares about the last three of these: activation, retention, and engagement. They'll do some of the first, but they really care about conversion. Developer advocacy probably cares about more of the first two, and some of the last. It just depends on what the company wants them to pay attention to. But I've always said developer advocacy and developer relations is developer marketing. Developer marketing is more than developer relations. A lot of folks don't think about that. And so coming back to your question, do you find that there are some folks who sort of hang out in specific phases of the journey? Yes, because they're paid to. Some folks are also really naturally skilled at it. Like I have a guy on my team who absolutely is a developer marketer. Not the right fit necessarily for what we need. So we're always thinking about how do we take those developer marketing skills and apply them to what I need out of advocacy. Does that answer your question, Chad? I want to make sure I did get it.
No, it makes sense. It makes sense. So like the idea is pretty much, I guess, however you kind of, what skills you add to the company at the time, it sounds like.
And what the company needs. Because the other side to this is you're not valuable if the thing you provide to the company is not important to them. And it's, I mean, right? Like people talk about value in very intangible ways. I think about value very tangibly. Someone parted with something because you gave them something in return for the thing they parted with. It could be cash, it could be time, it could be products, something. Someone parted with something because you gave them something in return for that thing they parted with. That's value at the end of the day. So from my perspective, if you bring a set of skills to the table and the company's not willing to pay you for it, that's not value. But that's my business brain coming to mind. Let me hit Jay's question, because Jay said, how do you talk past the X per post mindset? Because they can't separate views and activations. Tell me more there.
So, and I say all of this with like, as of November, like our entire chain of command got reorged. So, our CMO got laid off, which is like that was a whole thing. But there was this conversation around every piece that we write needs to be thought leadership. It needs to be non-technical, and it needs to be like drawing decision makers, CTO level people in the room. And in my mind, I'm like, you're asking a team of developers, none of which who have ever worked with CTOs, none of which who have ever presented at that level to create this level of content. And the reality of that is the wrong people, like they're going to write to the wrong audience. They're going to send the wrong messaging, and it's not being looked at. It's not being corrected. It's not being overviewed. So what's happening is it's failing in terms of, just number of attention, but it's also failing in feedback. No one's saying anything. No one's talking about it. No one's sharing it. No one's giving their opinion. So it's almost like, well, no one said it sucked, so maybe it was just bad timing. And it was like, no, it sucked. The people who were writing it told you it sucked, and the people who were writing it told you that they shouldn't be writing it, though. And I'm hoping that some of that changes now, because we're in a different leadership structure. We're going back to community. We're going back to developer conversation. But there is still that mentality of, if I'm like, I got to spend this money to get more content out, they're like, oh, well, how many views is that going to turn into? And I'm like, look, if it gets 5 views and all 5 of those views turn into activations, that is better than the hundreds of views that we were getting that turned into silence.
Yeah, you're asking a marketing question because there's 3 additional questions that come in here. One is, how do you know that something is the right piece of content? A company, from a business perspective, if I were like my Auth0 developer content lead brain, the right piece of content means it drove CTAs. And the CTA clicks, which is conversion. And conversion does not mean signups. Conversion means conversion, which means like if I put a
Action.
thing that said, hey, follow me here, and they click that, that's conversion. That is almost the same as if I put a thing at the end of a post that says, to continue on, sign up here, and they click that too, right? Those 2 are conversions, but they have different monetary value to the company.
Yeah.
So the question that I'm wondering is, how do you know that a piece of content is the right content? And then the second is, how do we know that it's targeting the right persona? When I hear them say they're targeting those personas, what I think is those are the decision makers who they've seen in deals cut checks. And so because that's the reason, they want to keep targeting that audience because that audience cuts checks for them. I could be wrong though.
No, I mean that's accurate. It's like their argument was DevRel needs to create content for technical decision makers, which technical decision makers are the CFO, because if the CFO says the money ain't there, it doesn't matter. You're not getting the product. The CTO, the CEO, because if the CEO says make it happen, it's probably going to happen whether the money's there or not. So